Let's first discuss Koryo's place in the world. Koryo came into being in the 10th century, in the early 10th century, after a period of war and strife on the Korean peninsula. So as such, it's a good idea for you to understand and enjoy this lecture, to have at least some kind of knowledge about the states on the Korean peninsula in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and perhaps also of the East Asian states, like those in China, in Northeast China, which used to be Manchuria, and perhaps also in Japan. It will help you understand and help you contextualize the lecture I'm about to give. Koryo came into being in the 10th century, and it came into being as a unification, as a unified state that brought together the three later kingdoms of Shilla, Baekje, later Baekje, and later Goguryeo. And it named itself after one of those earlier states on the Korean peninsula, Goguryeo. Koryo is really just abbreviation of the original name of the most northern of the three Korean kingdoms, Goguryeo. And if you look at the map of Koryo in the 10th and 11th century, you'll see that it really is not very different from what would be a unified Korea today, so North and South Korea put together, with the exception perhaps of part of the North. Now the North is extremely important in this lecture also, I'll refer to that later, but roughly speaking, most of what would be today South Korea and North Korea, with the exception of the north of what is now North Korea, would constitute the majority of the Koryo territory. The northern frontier, you can see on the map here, which really looks like today's South and North Korea put together, that parts of the northern frontier are not really part of Koryo, of the Koryo state. Well, there is a story to this that will explain this, and it has much to do with the presence of, perhaps in my view at least, the most important foreigners, the most important foreign presence in Koryo history, that of the Jurchen. The Jurchen were a people, or maybe I should say a confederation of different peoples who lived in the north of the Korean peninsula and the south of what is now called Tongbei, the northeast of China, but which used to be called Manchuria. And they were, it's not exactly clear where they come from or who they are, and that would be another lecture. What is important here is what they did there. If you look at the map here, you can see Northeast Asia in its entirety and Koryo as part of Northeast Asia. And one important point I would like to make here in advance, and I'll get back to this in this lecture later on, is the fact that despite Koryo's relative small size, if you compare it to, for example, China to the west and Manchuria, where the Liao and the Jin dynasties were during the 10th, 11th and 12th centuries, to the north, you can see that Koryo is really quite a bit smaller. Having said that, Koryo always played an important role in maintaining a balance between the different states in Northeast Asia. So it's extremely important not to be impressed by the size difference. Both policymakers and politicians in Chinese states and in Manchurian states always worried about what Koryo would do. Why? Because if Koryo would ally itself with Chinese states, it would perhaps be stronger than the Manchurian state. And on the other hand, if Koryo would ally itself with the Manchurian state, it would perhaps be stronger than the Chinese state. So Koryo always played an important role, despite its relative, well, small size. And to be honest, Koryo, the Korean peninsula, isn't that small to begin with. Anyway, it's good to have this out of the way, because what I would like to talk to you about are the Jurchen, the people who lived on the frontier, the northern frontier of Koryo, and that's the only land frontier that Koryo had. The other frontiers, Koryo or the Korean peninsula, being a peninsula, were of course sea, naval or marine frontiers. Now, the only way to go to the rest of the mainland was to go through the territory that was basically not only lived in by Jurchen, but also to a certain extent ruled by Jurchen. And the Koryo state claimed this territory, so from the point of view of Koryo, the Jurchen were Koryo subjects. They were also subjected to Koryo law, and they basically had to listen to what the Koryo king or the Koryo rulers or the Koryo army would tell them to do. Now in practice you see that this actually doesn't happen, and that's the interesting part. And this has much to do with the fact that we don't really know who the Jurchen were. It's quite clear that they came from different parts. Part of the Jurchen came from the northern part of Manchuria. Part of them were probably people who had survived the collapse of a previous state in Manchuria, the state of Pare. And other Jurchen we don't really know. We know that they worked together. We know that they presented one front towards Koryo, but we don't really know where they came from. We do know that they were very difficult to deal with. And that's the Koryo, the state, always had a problem with the Jurchen because they were difficult to deal with. And at the same time, they couldn't really do without the Jurchen because it was through them that much of the trade with the mainland took place. It was through them that the Koryo army, for example, received information about what the other states on the mainland did. So, in a very literal sense, the Jurchen are both Koryo's most intimate enemy and most hostile friend. It's a very dynamic relationship, a love-hate relationship if you want to put it in those terms. Koryo found it impossible to really rule the Jurchen unless they would send out an expedition, like for example happened when Yun Guan, a famous Koryo general, was sent out to the Jurchen to conquer them. And he briefly seemed like he had conquered them. He met them in battle and he won, and then the Jurchen didn't meet him in battle anymore. He built 9 forts and he had pacified the region. The thing is, as soon as the Koryo armies were gone, the Jurchen took over again. So these were in a way also masters of perhaps guerrilla warfare. If you wanted to fight them, they weren't there. Which made it very difficult for Koryo to really rule them. And as a result, they didn't. Most of the time they let them be, which was to the advantage of both sides. Now, who were these Jurchen in some more detail? I think if we look at the Jurchen and the things they did for Koryo, we can roughly divide those activities in 4 different kinds of activities. If we take a look at the Jurchen and their activities, we can roughly divide those activities in Koryo and for Koryo in 4 different categories. Now the interesting thing is that those 4 different categories in which the Jurchen were active in Koryo or for Koryo also seem to apply to their activities outside of Koryo in Liao. And Liao, or the Khitan, were the northern neighbor of Koryo, a neighbor with which they for a long time had a very good relationship, but the beginning of the relationship in the late 10th and early 11th century is very difficult, and the Jurchen played an important role there. The same kind of role they played for Koryo. Now, let's take a look at those 4 different categories. The first category I think that is most clear for the Jurchen is the category of frontier guard. They lived in the frontier, they were the frontier people. And this is perhaps their most important role, and certainly the role for which they are probably best known. They lived in the frontier, so they were the people who guarded the frontier. And this is something which you also see in Chinese history. It's not something that only occurred in Koryo history, but it is something to take note of. So the people who guard your frontier are actually not the same people who live in the rest of the country. That is an important point. The more important point here to make even is the fact that if the Jurchen undertook the same activities in Koryo as in Liao, you can see a problem here, because they would also be the frontier guards for Liao. And when Koryo and Liao were on good terms with each other, when there was no war or no looming conflict or no tensions that seemed to get out of hand, this wasn't too much of a problem for either Liao or Koryo. But when those 2 countries did find themselves in a situation of elevated tension, then the fact that the people who were guarding your frontier could very well be the people who would guard the other ones, the enemy's frontier, next month or next year, or had in fact been guarding the enemy's frontier last year, then that could be a problem. And it's this very ambiguous relationship and ambiguous status of the Jurchen that characterizes who they were. So in the sources we actually find some of the same people, the same Jurchen, who guarded the frontier on the side of Koryo for Koryo, or on the side of Liao for Liao. And you can imagine that they would make sure that they would get paid anyway, no matter whom they were working for. Now, that's the first category of activities. The second category of activities is also an activity for which they were well known. They were merchants. So decade after decade, leaders of the same Jurchen communities, this is important, visited the Koryo capital to trade. They themselves had things to trade, but they also functioned as the groups or the merchants who would buy things in Koryo and take it to, for example, Liao, or take it to the Chinese Song dynasty. The Song state had been founded in 960. So from 960 onwards, you see that the Jurchen play a very important role of middleman, really, between Koryo and Liao and Koryo and Song. Now there is something very important here, that what we see is that there were two Liao or Khitan invasions of Koryo in 993 and in 1010. And the one in 1010 really led to war, and a war that would not end until 20 years later. These wars are usually understood as expressions of Liao aggression towards Koryo. I think we have to look at the Jurchen to explain what was happening there. What you see, if you take a good look at the sources, is the fact that whenever Koryo was not capable of controlling the Jurchen, of making sure that they weren't being too rowdy or weren't invading too many villages and weren't left to their own devices, in which case they could be very aggressive and could undertake all kinds of invasions and make life in the frontier area very difficult, not just for Koryo but also for Liao. In those cases you see that Liao approaches Koryo and tells Koryo basically, shape up and you have to do something about this. You can't let the Jurchen run wild. If Koryo didn't listen, then the Liao would themselves discipline the Jurchen by invading Koryo territory, disciplining the Jurchen and perhaps also fighting Koryo armies. So this is I think an extremely important moment in Koryo history, because it shows you the crucial role the Jurchen played, their fundamental ambiguity. They were neither pro-Koryo or anti-Koryo, but they were neither pro-Liao or anti-Liao. And at the same time, they were there. They were always there. And they were important to maintain trading networks. They're important to guard the frontier. And they were important, and I'll get to that in a minute, for other things as well. So it's very important for the maintenance of commercial networks with Liao, with Song and the rest of Asia even, to be able to talk to the Jurchen. And that's what you see happening in times of peace. Decade after decade, leaders of the same Jurchen communities, they have the same names but they're not the same people. These are probably titles, visiting the Koryo capital to trade. And only when this was impossible and the frontier and the countries or states like Liao started to suffer from the lack of commercial relations with Koryo, then the situation would get tense and the possibility of a war would loom large. And this happened, in fact, a number of times. And the longest time in the early 11th century. Now, let me first get back to the other activities that the Jurchen undertook. What you see here on the screen, by the way, are two coins from the Koryo dynasty that were minted under the direct influence of the Khitan state. There's another activity in which the Jurchen really came into their own, and that was of guide. They were the people who lived in the frontier territory. They were the people who knew the territory there, the frontier, better than anyone else. And not just on one frontier, on one side of the frontier, they knew both sides of the frontier. And if you look at the sources, it's actually really nice to read the original sources on this, because you find people who used to work for the other side and now worked for Kodio, and they used to work for the Khitan, or the other way around, and sometimes they would switch depending on where they would find their livelihood more easy. And I guess if you would put all this together, so frontier guards, merchants, and guides, then you come to the fourth category, and that is that of spies, which is really a kind of a romantic word for people who deliver intelligence to the state. So for Kodio and for Liao, for both states, it was extremely important to know what the other state was about. Was there perhaps a buildup of troops somewhere that would indicate perhaps the possibility of an invasion? Things like that. You do want to know where your neighbor, even if you have good relations with your neighbor, you do want to know the military and the security situation at the frontier. Now, the people who were more suited than anyone else to give you that kind of information were, of course, the Jurchen, because they kind of freely moved around both Kodio, its north part, and Liao, its southern part. They were interconnected. As I said before, there were very different Jurchen communities, probably also with very different backgrounds and very different ways of life, but still they formed a kind of confederation. I'm not entirely sure whether this is the proper word to use, but that's at least how I conceptualize it. So if you read the sources, it's very ironic perhaps, and also kind of funny to see how in one case a Jurchen who used to work for Kodio goes to Liao and tells Liao, you better be careful and you better send more troops to the frontier, because I've seen a buildup of troops and of the things you need for warfare, like food, in Kodio. So they're stocking their granaries. So they are preparing an invasion, perhaps. Now the same Jurchen also went to Kodio, where he's basically told the same story. I've just been to Liao, and you have to be careful. You have to prepare for war, because I'm seeing a buildup of the army. I'm seeing a stocking of the granaries and things like that. And in this way, of course, this particular Jurchen would probably get paid twice, which is good, I guess, from his point of view. But there is a more deeper and fundamental reason why this would be good for the Jurchen. The Jurchen thrived in an environment in which neither Kodio nor Liao could fully control them. So when Kodio and Liao were on speaking terms with each other and they communicated well, the Jurchen had no chance to do whatever they wanted to do. When the Jurchen did not, when the Kodio and Liao did not have that proper communication going on, then the Jurchen were the ones they talked to, because the Jurchen were basically the intelligence providers for the entire frontier region. So a certain amount of tension was to their advantage. So that's what you see basically all the time, Jurchen trying to make trouble. Not so much trouble that you would actually get war, but enough for both sides not to trust each other. And it is precisely their ambiguous position as kind of foreigners within Kodio, because they were not fully foreign, but they were not fully Kodioan either, that gives them the position to do this and to benefit from a state of affairs that would, I guess, for most regular inhabitants of either Kodio or Liao, would not be a very good situation to find themselves in. So again, as I said, in here you see another example of what the sources tell us. The ease with which Jurchen can pass for Khitan or for Kodioans or for Jurchen, and the ease with which they cross the border and make that ambiguous position work for themselves, and rather less for Kodio or for Liao. Now, I'm slowly approaching my conclusion here. The Jurchen are, in my estimation, the most underestimated presence in Kodio history. They are absolutely vital to understand Kodio's international relations and to understand how Kodio dealt with diverse groups within the territory itself. Are these Jurchen foreigners, or are they really subjects of Kodio? Well, if you would ask the Kodio state at that moment, they would have said that the Jurchen are definitely subjects of Kodio. Ask the Jurchen self, and they would probably tell you, well, there's a reason we live in the north where the state can't really reach us. So there's ambiguity involved, and that's probably the most important term or concept connected with the Jurchen. And I like to sum it up like this. The Jurchen, in my estimation, were Kodio's most intimate enemy. They were Kodio's enemy at times, but they knew Kodio like they knew themselves, and Kodio knew them very well, and most hostile friend. They were at the same time friends. They were important for Kodio's trade relations, for its diplomatic relations, for the security of its border regions. But they weren't very easy friends to get along with, so which is why I think the expression most intimate friend and most intimate enemy and most hostile friend is fitting. And the Jurchen-Kodio relations are, as I mentioned before, very, very close, and they last a long time. Roughly they begin even before Kodio comes into itself as a dynasty, and they outlast the Kodio dynasty. Well, not the relations with the Kodio state, because the Kodio state disappears in 1392, but the Jurchen remain an extremely important presence also in the Choson dynasty, although in a different way. The Jurchen, as foreigners or as subjects of Kodio, or both, and sometimes they were both at the same time, sometimes they switched roles, they lived near the frontier, so they lived both in Kodio and in Liao territory, on the other side of the river, roughly speaking, frequently. And this is really their territory, even if they didn't turn it into a state until the 12th century, but I'll get to that later. There were Jurchen groups who lived in Kodio territory, but they didn't have this ambiguous position. They were just other ethnic groups within the majority of the Kodio ethnicity. And this is, I think, an important characteristic also, which I haven't mentioned so far, is that the importance of their presence in Kodio is recognized by the fact that what is called the jus territorialis was applied by Kodio to them, which means that as long as the Jurchen committed crimes on Kodio territory, but not against indigenous Kodio people, the Kodio state would not interfere. Or if it would interfere, it would apply Jurchen common law, so it would not use Kodio law. It would recognize the integrity of the Jurchen culture, in other words. Now, you don't do this with an ethnicity or a group within your society that you find dangerous or that you don't want to have there. So, the keywords for this lecture, I think, are, first of all, Jurchen. Then Jurchen as frontier commanders, as merchants, as guides, as spies, as a mixture of all these roles in one group. And unfortunately also the Liao invasions of 993 and 1010, which show you what would happen if the Jurchen would get out of control, which again underscores the enormous importance of the Jurchen presence, the structural importance of the Jurchen presence in Kodio.